When I shared my reading goal of 100 books a year in the New Year's update, a listener emailed in with the simple question of how? How does one go about reading 100 books a year? Well, that's an excellent question, and it's one I hope to answer today. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and I love reading. Hence my goal of reading as many books as physically possible in a year. But it's actually very worthwhile asking how that is done. So I was very grateful for the question that came in. I do want to answer an equally important question though, which is why? So that's what I'm going to do first, if the listener will allow it. And then we're going to go into the different ways in which I managed to get about reading quite so many books. So that first question, why would you set yourself a reading goal? And why would you set it quite so high? I think that's actually quite important. In the episode I did a while back on how to get through reader's block, I already spoke about figuring out what kind of reader you are before you kind of settle down to get reading done. And for someone like myself, who is a very avid reader, and for whom it's also a big part of how they relax, etc., I know that reading is a big priority for me. By setting a goal for myself, I can kind of make myself read. Now, that maybe sounds a bit paradoxical, because if I'm already someone who loves reading, why would I have to make myself read? And well, the simple answer to that is that there's just so much to do. Both in the sense of there's so much work to do, but there are also so many other fun things to do. Watching films, watching movies, meeting up with friends, other hobbies, and all of that kind of stuff. Maybe going outside, touching some grass, also important. So even though I really enjoy reading, I do have to sometimes convince myself into reading. Having a goal, which feels achievable to me, but also still a little aspirational, like 100 books a year, gives me that little reminder every once in a while that says, hey, you could also get off Instagram or off Tumblr and pick up a book, one of the many books that you've put on your to-be-read list and that are currently waiting for you on your Kindle. How about you do that? So in that sense, setting a reading goal or almost a reading challenge for myself in that way just functions as a little extra push to do it. I will say that when I first started setting reading goals a few years ago, in a way it was also because I maybe wanted to show off a little bit with my reading, having that way of actually tracking it, especially through apps like Storygraph or Goodreads. It does feel like an achievement then, like you're doing something serious rather than just reading. So there was kind of that aspect of it as well. And because that played a role in me setting up that goal initially, I then also felt quite a bit of pressure. I felt like, oh, okay, now that I've said this, and now that I've told people I'm going to read 100 books a year, I should. And oh my God, okay, I haven't read a book yet this week. I need to do that now. And oh my God, what book am I going to pick? Maybe I can pick a short book. So there was a lot of pressure that I put on myself through a reading goal like that. Added to that was that I also failed, technically, that goal for the first 2 years that I set it, because 100 books is a lot. That comes down to 2 a week, and 2 weeks in which you can maybe just read one. So it is a lot. And at a certain point, I had to have a stern conversation with myself, if you'd like to imagine it that way, where I just said, okay, 100 books a year is a lot. If I don't make that, it's absolutely fine. If I only make it halfway to 50 books, that's already a lot. Stop putting such pressure on something that you're technically wanting to enjoy. In that sense, setting a reading goal of 100 books kind of changed for me. Instead of becoming something I had to do, it became, well, something more of an aspiration, something I would like to get as close to as possible, but I felt less pressure to actively do it. It was more just there as a little reminder for myself. But the reason I also wanted to go into the why of it is because, well, reading has become, well, how do I put this? Reading has become something of a competitive sport almost on social media, I feel. I think it's always good when people read. I also think it's good when people read a lot. I think it's good whatever they read, whether it's mostly nonfiction books or if it's mostly romances or fantasy or anything like that. I think it's good that people are engaging with books and that they're also finding people to talk about that online. But especially when it comes to things like Book Talk and also Bookstagram a little bit, so the corners of those apps that are dedicated to books, the act of reading is becoming very commercialized and very competitive. There are people who have book reading targets of 250 books a year, and that just feels so excessive to me, which may sound very weird considering I've put my own target quite high at 100 books. But when it comes to reading quite so many books, once you go over 100, you're having to read multiple books a week, as in 4 to 5 books a week, so that you can maybe also take a week off. Then you're reaching the point at which reading becomes less of a fun activity and more of a consumption thing. You're just trying to consume as many books as possible. And what's actually quite interesting to me, at least, is that in the past few weeks, I've actually seen kind of comments pop up on those corners of the internet where reading is so competitive, saying, I'm actually not enjoying the pressure of having to read so much and keeping up to date with new releases and reading these massive books. And there were kind of people sharing stories of how they would listen to audiobooks but sped up with almost triple the speed normal, or how they would be skim reading instead of reading properly so that they could reach their target and get as many books done as possible without then actually remembering what the book was really about. And that's, of course, well, I say of course, but well, I think that is not the purpose of reading. I think you do have to allow it a certain amount of time. You want to actually get to understand the book, get to know the characters. Not every book needs to be super deep, of course. Some books can just be fun entertainment, but then you want them to be fun. You don't want it to be a pressured activity like, oh my God, I still have to brush my teeth. You know, getting a book and sitting down with it should be fun and relaxing and informative, depending on the book. So that's why it's worth contemplating why you might want to set a reading target. If, like myself, you're setting yourself a target just as a reminder to occasionally pick up a book rather than other activities, then I think it's absolutely fine. And then you want to set it somewhere between where you think, okay, that's doable and that's aspirational. Somewhere between there is, I think, where you'd want to set your target. So, for example, if you know that, well, you can get about a book done every 2 months, kind of snatching time here and there in the evening or maybe on a lunch break during a weekend to read for half an hour or so, then you're like, okay, great. So that's 1 book every 2 months. That would be about 6 books a year. Let's raise it up to 10 to see if I can get there. That is absolutely great. That way you can kind of both strive towards the reading, maybe push yourself a little bit more if that is what you want, if you want to read more. Or you can just set the target where you think, yeah, if I read a book every 2 months, that's great. If I only read 1 book over 3-4 months, that's also fine. And if you're more kind of a reader who says, I don't even know where to start, I don't even make it through a book a year, then maybe a reading goal that is above 1 or 2 is maybe not necessarily where you want to go. Then maybe rather the next section where we talk about how you read multiple books a week or a month or a year. That is maybe the more useful section. So I wanted to briefly talk about the why, because I'm not a big fan of making reading into a competitive sport, and I'm also not a big fan of turning reading into something that is purely something you consume, something you do in order to tick it off at the end without actually letting the experience resonate and settle in. That hopefully takes care of the why part of this question. Why would you set yourself a reading goal? Well, potentially to remind yourself that occasionally you want to read, which is true in my case, and I'm just going to stick with myself as an example here. So for myself, I set the target of 100 books a year because I feel that is, on the one hand, aspirational because it's a lot, but it's something I could technically do if I dedicate myself to it. The reason I think it is possible, on the one hand, is because I managed it last year and the year before, but also because reading is a very active part of my life and has been for, well, as long as I can remember, really. I've always had a book around, and I've always enjoyed reading and gotten a lot out of it. But still, how do I do that? The main thing, really, I think, when it comes to that question of how do you do that, is I think the question of how do you find the time to actually sit down and read. On the one hand, of course, that is to a certain extent attention span. Your attention span is something that you'll have to train if you don't read a lot at the moment. A lot of kind of the way in which news and information finds us nowadays is very quick and it's very short. We get short clips, short articles, which means that we don't really have to pay attention for more than 10 minutes or so. And that can make it quite difficult to then sit down with a book for a couple of hours to read it, because your attention span just doesn't stretch quite that far. And in that sense, you should really consider your attention span like a muscle. You'll need to train it. I remember when I briefly considered taking up running as a hobby. I dropped that very quickly. But as I looked into it, there were all these kind of tips that said you start by walking for 10 minutes a day. Then you expand that to walking for 20 minutes a day. Then you expand that to walking for 30 minutes a day. And then you start running for 5 minutes and then for 10 minutes. And basically it talked about how you build this up. You can't just head straight into running for half an hour in the park and expect your body to keep up with that. You need to train it. And you also need to train it in gradations. You can't just start with the running. You need to build your strength up first by doing the walking, by building that time into your schedule as well. I think it's the same with your attention span. You don't want to dive straight into War and Peace and have the prospect of 1,000 odd pages and then having to sit down with that brick of a book and be like, I'm going to be here for hours. Because then you're kind of punishing yourself rather than training yourself. So you want to start short. You want to maybe start by reading a graphic novel, for example. Or you want to pick up a short story collection or a poetry collection and just once a day read a poem, let it sink in, and then also allow yourself to close the book and say, I did my training today, excellent. That poem was interesting. Or that poem was not so interesting. I hope the one tomorrow is better. But that way you can slowly start building up to it if reading is not something you're actively doing yet. So that is on the one hand, the how of the time question, which is building up your capacity to actually read for an extensive period of time. The other thing is then, of course, finding that extensive period of time in your schedule. Most of us, if not all of us, have very busy lives with a lot of different things to do, and reading does not necessarily feel like a massive priority there. And there I do have to say that in part the answer is very simple, which is you have to make it a priority. If you want to read a book this month, you will have to set a couple of hours aside this month in order to do that. In my case, because I do enjoy reading so much, and because now it's also, in a sense, part of my job, I do set that time apart, which means I don't necessarily do other activities people might do. Maybe I should go outside more. Maybe I should hang out with friends more often, or maybe I should watch a movie every once in a while. Or maybe let's change should to could. Those are all things I could do to relax, to de-stress from everyday life, but I choose reading most of the time as my activity to calm down, which means I also don't spend a lot of time in the garden. I haven't been knitting a lot recently, but that's fine by me. So on the one hand, you'll just have to make the choice to make reading a priority and actually put aside everything else and pick up that book. Now, I struggle with that as well sometimes. That is why, for example, I have that reading goal. Because over the past few days, for example, there would be times where I'd be on my phone in bed and I was like, I've been doing this for half an hour now. I could be reading as well. And then sometimes reminding myself, oh yeah, because we want to read a book this week. That will encourage me to actually put aside my phone and pick up my Kindle and start reading my book. Other ways in which I kind of squeeze in reading is that I have a commute to work. I read there. I read in the evenings. I will read during my lunch break sometimes. And those are all kinds of different ways in which you can incorporate reading. And that's how you can find that time. Because in the end, it does come down to the minutes you spend on it, right? Reading half an hour on the bus each morning means that by the end of the day, when I've also had my journey back, I've read for an hour that day. And that will actually get you quite far in many books. So the first answer really to how do you read that many books is you got to make the time. And kind of the sub answer to that is you've got to train yourself to actually be able to do it. Training yourself, however, also goes a little bit further than just working on your attention span. And that is also how we get to what I would call almost my second answer to the question of how. And that is to build up knowledge. That sounds not fun. I appreciate that. But just as, for example, with running, you need to build up your endurance. So you also need to build up your skill set, which allows you to run properly, whether that comes down to, the placement of your feet or anything like that. You need to pick up different tools and techniques to allow you to recognize certain situations about the activity that you're doing. When it comes to reading, what helps you to read quickly is to know what you're going to read. Maybe that sounds paradoxical as well. But for example, when I read a thriller, especially a Western thriller, I pretty much know what I'm going to get. It's kind of like when you order a pizza. It's always the same pizza that you order. You know what's going to be on it. You know you're going to enjoy it. It's not going to kind of challenge you massively. Unlike if you ordered something you'd never ordered before, right? Then you wouldn't know what might be on the plate. You wouldn't know what it tasted like, how your body would respond to it, etc. A thriller for me is like a pepperoni pizza. It's a thing I very much enjoy and that maybe I enjoy a little too often. With thrillers, I know what the basic plot is going to be. I roughly know how the characters are going to function. Most thrillers will have, their main character who either has something bad happen to them, or maybe they're the one who's had something bad in their past and that they're trying to hide. There's a couple of different configurations of the main characters that you're going to get in a thriller. And by now I've read most of those configurations, I would say. So I know who I'm going to meet and I roughly know what is going to happen. I know that there's going to be crimes, there's going to be a little bit of suspense, I'm going to get to look for clues, and at the end it's all going to be explained to me. On top of that, most thrillers take place in, what I would call the real world. So the world of the story is usually set in our own time period, in our own actual planet. So I'm not necessarily going to have to learn any weird names or, those fantasy names that have so many vowels that you're like, what's happening here? I won't have to look at any maps to figure out where this kingdom is in relation to another kingdom. Most of the things will be very straightforward. The characters in most modern thrillers will have their cell phones with them. They'll Google things, they'll go grab a coffee, and they'll live in houses or apartments that we can easily imagine because we've experienced them ourselves. So reading thrillers in that sense doesn't require a whole lot of imagination, almost. Most of the things are already filled in for me, and the others I can quite easily fill in with my own experience. That is the way in which building up a certain knowledge about a genre makes it easier to read it. I have to make less of an effort to get into a thriller because I already understand what it's going to give me. That is why I can read a thriller in an afternoon. I can spend 2-3 hours, read a 200 to 300 page book because I know what's going to happen. I don't have to invest as much attention into understanding the details. It is slightly different with other genres. So for example, like I mentioned earlier with those fantasy names that have too many vowels or that make you question how they're meant to be pronounced, so your brain just comes up with something that sounds acceptable, fantasy books, but also science fiction books, usually have very detailed worlds. And they have a lot of different avenues and tropes that they can use or go down. And that means when I want to read a fantasy book, I have to set a little bit more time aside. When I make my choice of what I want to read, I also know how much energy, time, attention I have to give at that point. For example, I'm recording this on a Saturday, and I know that this afternoon I'll probably want to read a book. Am I ready to dive into something completely different? Am I ready to kind of really invest time and effort to explore a new world and figure out kind of what the rules are, what the land looks like, what the people are in relation to each other, if there is a long history? Is that something I want to do? Do I want to start something big? Or do I want to have a fun time reading something that is familiar and relatively easy but thrilling? If it's the first, I'll pick up a fantasy book. I'll dive right in and start exploring a whole new world with the full knowledge that it's going to take me quite some time. If I want the second option, I'll pick up a thriller. I'll say, this is what I want to read right now. I don't necessarily want to have to continue with this tomorrow. I don't want it to go too far. I just want to have a fun time and read a book. So that's what I mean with you want to build up a certain kind of, almost toolbox of knowledge so that when you pick up a book, you already have enough background information to know how much this is going to require of you. With fantasy and science fiction, you're going to need quite a lot of time to get settled in that world initially. Most authors do an excellent job of kind of gently introducing you to how the world works, but you're still going to have to do a lot of that work yourself as well. You're going to have to really sink into that world and make sure that it sticks with you. That's also why I build in a lot of time for fantasy books. I know I'm going to have to dedicate enough time to it so that I actually care. If I'm speed reading a fantasy book because I feel like I need to finish it so I can add an extra book to my tally for the reading challenge or reading goal, well, I'm not invested. I'm not getting anything out of it. Then why am I doing it? So that's just a little throwback to the why. Don't force yourself to read something. Building up a certain awareness of your genres, of what you enjoy reading, how much time it might cost, and if that's something you do now want to do, is, I think, very important to actually reading a number of books during the year, whether that is a very big number like 100 or a smaller number like 5. Regardless of what the number is, you want to make sure that you know what you're reading and that you're setting yourself up for a good reading experience there as well. Because that brings me to my third point, which is if you want to read a lot of books, you're going to have to allow yourself to stop reading certain books. You do not want to force yourself through something you're not enjoying, because that is what leads to you just getting blocked. That's also why I did that episode on getting through a reader's block, because I know that experience. I've had books on my list where I said, okay, I want to read that this year. I'm going to do it. I'm not enjoying doing this. And that's not good. That's not fun. That's not conducive to anyone enjoying themselves. So if you want to read a lot of books, no matter what a lot means to you, you're going to have to give yourself permission to just stop a book. If you've done your best, if you've sat down with it and after the first few chapters or after giving it an hour, you're like, no, I'm not connecting to this. I'm either not interested in the themes or the story that it's telling, or the writing isn't working for me, or this genre is demanding more attention of me than I'm now able to give it. Those are perfectly valid reasons to put down a book and say, maybe I'll get back to you later. This is also something I've seen floating around the sort of book dedicated internet, which is people kind of getting these really hyped books, which is people finding these really hyped books that there's a lot of drama about, that there are a lot of posts about all across social media, that they then feel like they have to read because everyone's reading them and they've already, raved about it and they read it so quickly and now you have to do it too. And then there's such a pressure built up around a text that it becomes quite hard to get through it. So when it comes to those really hyped books, when I see them and I think, hey, that sounds interesting, that sounds like a fantasy book that is right down my alley, I will still give it some time to allow all the kind of noise around it to sink away so that I can then dedicate the amount of energy, time, and attention I want to dedicate to it, rather than feeling forced to either be super positive about it when I don't like it, or to rush through it just so I can join the conversation. And that idea of rushing through it brings me to my fourth point about how. Because, well, this is also going to feel maybe a little paradoxical. I've used that word quite a lot so far. But you want to take your time with the books. You don't want to rush through them just so that you can add them to your list of books that you read this year. Because in the end, you are meant to enjoy it. All that time and attention you're putting into it, if by the end you don't remember any of it because you push through it or you rush through it, well then it's kind of wasted time. That again leads to probably a bit of a reader dissatisfaction, which will make it harder to pick up the next book. But it's also a shame because authors usually spend years on their books. They put a lot of time and dedication into it. And as a reader, you've also put time and dedication into it, so you want to enjoy it. It's, to go back to the pizza analogy, it's like having a chef make a nice pizza for you in a restaurant and then wolfing it down without chewing, and then afterwards wondering why your stomach hurts and kind of regretting that you didn't actually take the time to properly taste it. Technically, you've eaten, so you're technically fine, but was it the experience that you wanted it to be? No. And it actually helps you read more if you are enjoying the reading, if you're getting something out of it. If you have an excellent time doing something, you're much more likely to want to do it again. How do you read many books? By taking your time with them. And therefore, many books is subjective to the person. For me, I can read a book in the first half of the week and say, that was really fun, and then the next morning pick up a new one. That works for me. I can digest a book that way, in part because I've built up some experience with it. But for others, it could also be, I've read this book, that was great. Maybe next week I'll pick up another one, but I'm just going to let this one sink in a little bit more. I'm just going to enjoy it, or I'm just going to give my brain some time off. As long as it works for you, that is good. Now, I do have another little trade secret of mine to let you in on, which is that I tend to read multiple books at the same time. I usually have at least one paperback, so one physical book flying around that I'm reading. I'll have one or two on my Kindle that I switch back and forth on when I'm commuting to work, and quite often I'll have an audiobook waiting for me as well that I dip into when I'm cooking or cleaning or walking to the supermarket or something like that. Now, that is something that works for me. I'm able to kind of differentiate those stories and not mix them up. I do sometimes realize I've got too many going, and then I have to give some of them a break. If I realize that I'm just listening, for example, but not actually hearing the story, then I'll have to wait with my audiobook until there are moments where I can actually listen to it properly and connect to the story that it's telling me. Or if I realize that as I'm reading in the bus, I'm just glazing over and thinking about another book or about something completely different, maybe work related, I'll have to pause that book. But usually I'm pretty good at having those different stories kind of in different parts of the section of my brain dedicated to reading, where I'm like, yes, this is that book, this is that book. I can keep all of that in its own little neat corner. So for example, at the moment, I have an audiobook going, which is a version of The War of the Worlds, which combines the book by H.G. Wells with the musical production by Jeff Wayne. I've got that, listen to that when I go to the supermarket or when I'm walking around, or sometimes at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, which means it's just very short sections, but I'm very familiar with the tale, so it's almost like being read to sleep by Michael Sheen, with one of my favorite stories ever. Next to that, I've got A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martin lying on the desk next to me right now. It was gifted to me by my sister over Christmas, and I've been wanting to read that for a while. It's a science fiction book, and it's a complicated one. It's about politics, about imperial warfare, potentially. It's also a post-colonial take on science fiction, so there's a lot of world building in there, and it's taking me a very long time. I'm not reading it very quickly, but I'm taking my time with it, and I'm enjoying it. Next to that, I'm also currently rereading The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've recently signed up to a book club. Well, signed up is a bit official. I joined a WhatsApp group, and we're going to discuss the first part of The Fellowship of the Ring on Tuesday. That means I'm on a bit of a deadline. Like I said, I'm recording this on a Saturday, so this afternoon I'm probably going to have to start reading The Lord of the Rings. I've read that book before. I'm very familiar with the themes, with the films as well, so I'm going to put the soundtrack on. These are the 3 different books that I'm currently reading at the same time. They're all in some way fantasy science fiction-y, but they are stories that on the one hand I'm either very familiar with or that I'm willing to take my time with. That means that probably next week I will not be able to finish my dutifully assigned 2 books a week. It does mean that probably in a week and a half's time I'll have finished at least one of those, and then shortly after I'll finish the other 2, and then I'll have read 3 books. This might not work for everyone. Keeping kind of different stories separate in your mind is maybe not something that everyone enjoys doing. Maybe that feels like you're then forcing it. In that case, don't do it. But what I would recommend is exploring different formats. Using an audiobook version is still you engaging with the story. It still counts even if there are 2 different kind of activities in a sense. And if you have a Kindle or a paperback, if you're reading on your phone, if you're reading a graphic novel, those are all kind of activities that count under the big umbrella term of reading. There are ways in which you can build up that endurance. There are ways in which you can become more familiar with different genres and pick up on the little tricks that each of those genres uses to set up their story, which makes it easier to then read that story. And there are also different ways to maybe keep going with reading in different situations. We don't all want to be carrying around 10 books in a backpack just so that we've got something to do on a holiday. That's why I do enjoy having an e-reader as well. I'm going to edge towards a slight conclusion here. So I think if you want to read more books, the first thing to do is ask yourself why, and then what. So why do I want to read more? Is it because I feel like I should? Or is it because it's something I want to? Is it an activity that I remember enjoying when I was younger that I now want to get back into? Then a reading goal can be an excellent way to kind of force yourself, but in a gentle way. Maybe stimulate is a better word. To kind of stimulate into doing so, because you're like, okay, I've set this target for myself. I do want to read it. Humans are very goal-orientated creatures. And then that can be a little reminder to yourself to say, oh yeah, I wanted to read a book this month. Let's see what I can pick up. Let's see what I can find. Then once you've answered the why for yourself, be honest with yourself when you actually set the goal. So 100 books for me, even though I read a lot, it is a stretch. When I've met the goal in the past 2 years, that was almost always on the 30th or the 31st of December when I finished a book and realized I have actually made it to 100. Wow. I've also had years where I stalled out at 60, years where I managed to hit 45, and then that was fine as well, as long as I enjoyed the books. Like I also said in the New Year's update, when I look back on 2023, there weren't actually that many books that stood out to me as being really good, as books that really affected me, that really hit me. So in a sense, maybe I pushed myself a little too hard to read for reading's sake, rather than just to read the books that I wanted to. That's also why I'm trying to be less forceful with my reading this year. I want to read the books that I want to read, or that are connected to fun things like a book club. And not because, I should actually read this book because it's been on my list forever, and if I don't read it now, I'm never going to read it, so fine. Because that's no fun. So be honest when you set your target. If you think you could feasibly manage 5 books a year, that's excellent. That's 5 books you wouldn't otherwise have read. If you then want to push yourself, set it 2 or 3 books higher and see how you go with that. It's all good. It doesn't have to be 100, and please, by God, do not make it 250. I don't even know how those people remember what they read. I mean, what else do they do with their day? We all have to work for a living. What is it that you do? Anyway, now we've had the why and the what, and then the how. So basically, you have to find the time. You have to make time in your daily schedule to read, or at least your weekly schedule to read if you want to get books read. It's so simple that it almost feels trite, but it's true. You have to make it an active priority over other activities that you enjoy. You need to take that hour in the evening, not even hour, you need to take that half hour maybe in the evening and actually sit down with a book and see how far you get. Or on a sofa on a Saturday when the weather is shitty outside anyway, you might as well read a book. On top of that though, you need to allow yourself to train your endurance. Don't go straight in there expecting to be able to read at full speed for half an hour. Reading is a very intense experience when you actually dedicate to it. Your brain is doing an incredible amount of work when you read a book. So train yourself. Give yourself breaks. Build it up. Don't go straight into a massively complex book. Or if you decide to do that, take it in small pieces. At a certain point, I decided that I should read a classic. So I decided to read Les Mis by Victor Hugo. It's a big book. The man also likes to go on tangents. And so I basically agreed with myself, I'm going to read 5 chapters a week. Some chapters were super short, only like 5 pages. Other chapters were surprisingly long and felt disconnected to the plot. But because I was like, okay, I only need to read these 5 chapters. I do not need to read more than I have the time for, but this is achievable enough that I can squeeze it into an afternoon here or there. In that way, it took me months to read Les Mis. But it was a great experience because each week I knew I was getting back into that book, back into that story. And because I decided to take my time with it, I really arrived in the story. I really got to know what Hugo was trying to say, and I got to sit with the characters, and I spent enough time with them that the plot really affected me, and it became one of my favorite books. So take your time with it, set the limits that you want to set, build up on it. If you're going to read or do something big, train for it like a marathon. Then on top of that, the next tip was to basically get to know the genres that you're reading. Know what the genre is going to expect of you. If you're not necessarily super into romance or don't understand how romance works, you want to get to know how it works a little bit. Your first one is going to take more time. Your second one's going to be easier. By the time you read your 10th romance, you will have a certain familiarity with the tropes and the format of the genre that it becomes much easier. From there, you can then also expand to other genres, build up until you have a good enough understanding of each genre that you know what fits your mood and your time and your commitment at the moment. And you can always try reading multiple books at the same time. Sometimes a book will just hit a point where you're like, am I bored by this? Am I still connected to this? Maybe not. And then you need to allow yourself to stop, either by taking a break and picking up something else in the meantime, or by legitimately saying, this is not for me. A book does not have to be bad for you to not vibe with it. Sometimes it's just not for you. Not everything is for everyone. There's plenty of fantasy books which, according to the blurb, should be my cup of tea. And then I read the first chapter and I'm like, nope, this is not what I'm on the market for. I'm actually not interested in the world you're building. No hate to the author. I'm just not it. I'm not your reader. That's fine. There's plenty of others. I think that has been a pretty extensive answer to how you can read as many books as possible in a year. And the main takeaway for that really is to take it at your own pace. The word many is subjective. And so you shouldn't feel forced into matching other people's goals, the pace of other people. I'm always reminded of when I went hiking with my family when I was younger, and we all agreed that everyone was going to walk at their own pace. That way, we would sometimes encounter each other on the trail, sometimes we'd be walking in a group, sometimes one of us would be further ahead or one would fall behind a little bit, but we were all enjoying the walk in our own way and could then meet at the top and be like, this was excellent. Reading is very much the same way. Just because someone else is raving about a book doesn't mean you have to love it. Just because someone has already read 6 books this year doesn't mean you also should have read 6 books. It's a very equal opportunities kind of activity. Everyone gets to do it in the way that they enjoy. On that slightly preachery note, I think we're going to end it here. If any of you do have questions about reading, how to get into certain genres, what is up with science fiction, let me know. You can always send me an email. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.